Let's jump on to verse 17 through 25 when he talks of honoring the elders. And we're going to unpack Paul's teaching for Timothy and what he needs to do to honor the elders, to equip the elders, to empower the elders, and to be able to support them rightly. So he says this in verse 17, the elders who are good leaders are to be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching, right? As we discussed earlier when we were talking about the support of or the honoring of widows, likewise, this is talking again about finances. And he says the elders or the pastors who are good leaders are to be considered worthy of double honor. So let's unpack this. I think he's not saying that, right? He's not bashing bad leaders and good leaders while that was going on. What he's saying is that there are going to be particular men in the church, namely people God has called and gifted through the Holy Spirit that are exceptionally good pastors. They're going to stand out. And these pastors who are going to be giving more time, more energy, more of their week to the church, they need to be honored for that. They need to be paid for that time. And so without getting too far into it, we're going to deal with church structure and these positions in another video. So I'm not going to spend time here on this. But what I will say is that there should be in a healthy church godly men who are elders of the church, I think, who are not on paid staff. They're working full-time jobs, or maybe they're bivocational. They're part-time with a job and part-time with the church. Either of those are fine. But there's nothing against, and there should be men who are working full-time in other jobs. And not that they're also full-time pastors, but they are not vocationally pastors, but they are elders. They're elders on the church board and they work another job. They're part of the community. I think we are really challenged by this in our day and age because we're coming from models that we've only had full-time pastors who do everything in the church, at least in a lot of churches I've seen. Whereas the biblical model of house churches that was going on is a lot different. Most of the elders were probably not full-time, were not paid. But we do see here in these churches that there are men who are particularly gifted, who are giving their whole week, let's say, to the ministry of the church, and they don't have the time for another full-time job. And this has become their full-time job, and that's what Paul's addressing here. So they're to be considered worthy of double honor. And so this, the way I would explain this is to say double honor being utmost respect, double respect, or financial needs being met. So someone who is working a full-time job apart from the church, but also helps to lead the church as a pastor elder, they don't necessarily need a financial payment to do what they're doing because they're not devoting all their time to it. They're devoting the majority of their time to their other job. For someone who is devoting all of their time and has been agreed upon with the church, and there's that opportunity available for the financial resources to be given to them, that person, they should be paid for what they're doing because they're not, in giving all of their time to this craft, they're not going to be having time to also shepherd their family well, which is the most important thing, and to also work another job full time. That's just not a reasonable possibility. Maybe in a short amount of time or for a short season of life, pastors do bump into having to do this, but for a long-term thing, this isn't wise, and it's not going to ultimately be what God intended. And so that's why churches should support a pastor that's working full-time, being paid full-time, like anyone else who works a full-time job. So they're worthy of double honor. And he caricatures this, he particularizes this by saying especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching. Okay, so This is verse 17 of 1 Timothy chapter 5. This is where we get the idea of something that's called first among equals, something that may be called a primary preaching pastor, something that is sometimes called a senior pastor or a lead pastor. This is where we get the word bishop, someone who's first among equals. This is the verse that we'll be unpacking in another video as we talk about various offices within the church. But for our purposes here, we're just going to mention that it seems that there is a double honor very clearly in this verse, or maybe even extra generous is how I'll say it, an extra generous financial blessing that's given to this men or group of men, because it can be more than one. Those, right? It's not the one guy who works hard at preaching and teaching. Those who work hard at preaching and teaching. So this could be one pastor. This could be many pastors. But whoever is really laboring, they should be repaid for that effort. They should be honored for that effort. And Paul goes on to give reasoning here in verse 18. He says, "For the scripture says, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain, and the worker is worthy of his wages." So when we see "for the scripture says" in the New Testament, they're always talking about what we would see as the Old Testament, because that was what their scriptures were, okay? So the scripture says, he quotes here a passage that's actually Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4. I want us to look at that together. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4. There it is. "Do not muzzle an ox while it is out treading grain, while it treads out grain." The next thing he quotes in one sentence, Paul is really going after it. "Do not muzzle an ox while it is out treading the grain." And as you see, as this is in red here, the worker is worthy of his wages. And what he's quoting here is Luke chapter 10, verse 7 and 8. I want us to look at that as well. This is something that Jesus was teaching his people when they were to be going out sharing the gospel from town to town. He says, remain in the same house. This was the instruction Jesus gave. "Eating and drinking what they offer, for the worker is worthy of his wages. Don't move from house to house. When you enter any town and they welcome you, eat the things set before you. Heal the sick," etc., etc. But for Paul's purposes here and our purposes, what he's covering is that second end of verse 7, "Remain in the same house, eating and drinking what they offer, for the worker is worthy of his wages." He's saying you don't need, like if they're offering you food and so notice the contrast. Food and drink is different from private jet.
He made that airplane so cheap for me, I couldn't help but buy it.
Okay. So let me clarify that. But I mean, things that these people are going to need. You're going to need food at some point. You can't fast for the rest of your life. You're going to die. You're going to need food. You're going to need drink. You're going to need clothes on your back. You're going to need a way of making a means of living. And this doesn't mean private jet, but it also doesn't mean 10 grand a year to work full time in America, right? As a full-time pastor. There needs to be a balance. So when he says that the worker is worthy of his wages, that's what he's getting at all throughout this section. It's that Jesus' teaching is that the one who is wholeheartedly devoted to full-time ministry and the church has appointed and accepted them to be doing this. It's not just some guy out doing this on his own, unrightfully asking for money. But people recognize this gifting. People see this gifting. And this young man, right, as we're talking about elders and pastors here, is after the work of the ministry. They're worthy of being paid for this. This is, if they're devoting their whole life to it, there's no other way in which they'll have time for anything else. So they should be paid This is the teaching of the Old Testament and of Jesus Christ. And Paul affirms that here in verse 18. Do not muzzle an ox while it's out treading grain. He gives us this word picture of an ox while it's pulling, right? It's doing the work of plowing the fields. And during this work, he's, in Deuteronomy, the right care of animals was not to muzzle the ox. It was not to cover its mouth so that it's not able to freely eat as it's also working, right? So the way he is applying this to pastors is to say that just as it's wrong to mistreat an animal, just as it's wrong to the very ox that's plowing your field for you, if you cover up his mouth, you're mistreating that animal. Just in the same way, if there's a pastor that is out plowing fields, that is out sowing seed, is out doing the work of the ministry, and you don't allow them to be paid for this, you're mistreating them just like you'd be mistreating an animal. To not allow them to receive nourishment or pay from the very work that they're doing. And so the worker is worthy of his wages. That's just a clear teaching. I've heard people say, Grant, I don't think any pastor should ever get paid for what they do. Every pastor should work for free. This is just flat out unbiblical. This is in direct violation of the teaching of the scriptures. This is particularly for those who are working full time. So as I already stated, there's nothing wrong with a bivocational pastor, and there's nothing wrong with an elder of a church who is not full-time serving in the church, but is also helping shepherd, but is working a full-time job. There's nothing but room for these kinds of elders within the church. But as the church grows, as the church gets bigger, it's going to be very hard to maintain what they're doing at a certain capacity without a full-time man as a pastor or a full-time group of men as pastors to help share in the workload of this and to shepherd the church. So that's a clear teaching what the Bible teaches about pay of pastors, etc., etc. Verse 19, he says, don't accept an accusation against an elder unless it is supported by 2 or 3 witnesses, right? So as comes with being a pastor, there's always a lot of scrutiny over your life, over your teaching, over your family, over something you did or you didn't do. There's a lot of scrutiny that comes with being a pastor. And so knowing this, Paul says that they aren't to accept an accusation, right? So I don't know if you know or not, but pastors regularly in many circumstances and situations, many pastors, it's common that you're accused of something at some point. I've been a pastor long enough to know that you can literally be doing everything exactly right, and out of nowhere, you're going to get an accusation. Well, someone said Grant was doing this and doing that, and then you're confronted. Well, were you doing this? Well, no, I wasn't. But Paul gives us some unique instruction here to not accept an accusation against an elder unless it is supported by 2 or 3 witnesses. Okay? So the situation in my own life, one of them, which I was just thinking back on, this was one person who said something against me, and there was no truth to it. There was no other person that was claiming this, and it was just completely false. Someone was trying to gun me down. Don't know who it was. I pray the Lord blesses them. But, that shouldn't have been something that I had to deal with. That shouldn't have been something that I had to hear. That shouldn't have been something that I had to answer to, because it was just one person that was trying to blatantly lie about me and say something that they didn't know about what they were speaking of. So the way Paul is trying to instruct Timothy to shepherd the church and guard the church is that every single accusation, and let me tell you, There are many as a pastor. So that's why he's giving this teaching. From every single accusation, not every single one needs to be given ear. Not every single one needs to be approached and confronting the pastor with this. But that's particular if it's one person saying something, right? Or someone that's just, you're always going to have gripers and something going on in most churches. That's not what Paul's dealing with. He says then, unless it is supported by 2 or 3 witnesses, or in other words, if it's just one person, it could just be someone's trying to gun them down in their character. But when there's a group of people, that's when we're starting to see, okay, this is a big deal. This is probably got some truth to it, because it's not just one person or someone who's upset for a dumb reason. This is a group of people, so we do need to address this. We do need to confront this pastor and accept this accusation and explore this accusation and see if there's any truth to this accusation. But if it's unfounded and unwarranted, it shouldn't be accepted, right? So if someone is being attacked and it's just one person, there's no other person that's saying that, there's no other person that has any evidence for that, no one else has experienced that, it just needs to be shut down right there, right? No, I haven't heard this from anyone else. I'm not saying that's true or not, but right now there's no one else to experience that. And so hopefully, right? And remember, we're talking about pastor elders here, okay? So we're talking about men who should have been thoroughly vetted, that are thoroughly watched, that are thoroughly guarded in their life. That's why it's so important. There's this whole process, okay? So we can't take this passage and throw out the beginning passage that we read earlier in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Now, if you just threw some dumb guy into the pastorate and someone's accusing them, well, maybe you should explore it because you sinned earlier and you didn't check out to see if his character was quality. You didn't check out to see if his character was that of a good, righteous, and godly man. Okay? So we need to take all of this together. This is so important. I know probably what I'm saying in our shutdown and cancel culture. This Bible teaching is very against our culture. But I want you to remember, this is not just for any person. This is for a pastor who should have been thoroughly vetted in his character, in his quality of character, of teaching, of so many things, right? We covered that in chapter 3. So this isn't just some random guy. So that's why there's this strict walling off of maybe single person who's trying to throw accusations because they don't like him. This is very, very common in pastoral ministry, a big headache that pastors have to deal with. So don't accept an accusation against an elder unless it is supported by 2 or 3 witnesses. Then he says this, publicly rebuke those who sin so that the rest will be afraid. Okay, publicly rebuke those who sin so that the rest will be afraid. He's talking about elders here still. Publicly rebuking elders who sin. So don't accept an accusation of one person towards an elder. Make sure there's multiple witnesses, or check it out. And that's not a hard and fast rule. There's many things that have to be explored in these kinds of situations. But with that being said, if this elder who should have been vetted and checked before they were even allowed into the pastorate and continually walked alongside with from Christians, hopefully these things would be noticed. If this is being done, all these things that we've stated before here and in previous chapters, and we do catch an elder in sin, we do catch a pastor in a blatant, unrepentant sin that's disqualifying of him in the office, it says to publicly rebuke those. Publicly rebuke those elders who sin so that the rest will be afraid, right? So what he's telling Timothy here is that we need to take sin seriously. Sin is something that should scare us. It should terrify us. It should be something that we fear, sin in our life. And so publicly rebuking those elders who are not just accused, because pastors are very commonly falsely accused, but of those who are caught in doing some kind of sin. And many times the Lord does bring these things to light. And in time, he brings everything to light, but sometimes he brings these things specifically to light early on. And these pastors are to be dealt with publicly. The sin is to be confronted publicly. Sometimes this disqualifies the pastor and he needs to step down from the ministry he's serving in. It's a real tragedy, a real sad thing. And it needs to be dealt with. It doesn't need to be swept under the rug. He tells Timothy with stern language in verse 21, I solemnly charge you, like I soberly command you to do this, I solemnly charge you before God and Christ Jesus and the elect angels, the angels that weren't fallen angels and rebelled in sin, but the angels that are still with God in heaven, the chosen angels, to observe these things. He says, without prejudice, doing nothing out of favoritism, right? So when you're dealing with right treatment of an elder, when you're dealing with proper pay of an elder, when you're doing things like confronting elder who's in sin, all these things, it's not about prejudice. It's not about what you think you know. It's about what is the truth, what is the reality. It's not about who you like better. It's about the truth of who is serving and teaching and preaching and also ruling well. This person needs to be honored financially through that. Who is this elder that is living in sin unrepentantly? He needs to be cut out. He needs to be dealt with. He needs to be rebuked publicly. And it doesn't matter. Maybe you love them. Maybe you've been with them, serving alongside them for years, maybe even for a decade or more. This is, like I said, this is a real tragedy. But in the horrible, tragic circumstances of these things happening, and these pastors choosing to walk in sin, this is a decision they made. And as they say, you can make your bed and you have to lie in it. If pastors choose to go this route, they also have to face the consequences, because there's real repercussions, not only in this life, but also the life to come. And also, the Lord is not pleased with this. So these are things that need to be dealt with. This is not to say that every time a pastor commits some sort of sin that he needs to be kicked out or he needs to be publicly rebuked, because then nobody's going to be a pastor, okay? Because I know I don't meet the qualification of never sinning, and no one else does except for Jesus. So then we would have no pastors, okay? So it's not saying look for unrepentant sin in a pastor's life. Look for something that they didn't confront themselves, but rather they got caught in. That's a big deal. If it's something that they see in their own life and they're trying to get help, don't shut them down. Don't be a bully. Don't be a jerk. Help them alongside that. Now, if they can't shake that sin, can't get rid of that sin over time, then maybe they do need to step down. But if they see it and they recognize it and they're trying to change, there needs to be respect. There needs to be love. There needs to be grace. So check for repentant sin versus unrepentant sin. Check for sin that they are trying to hide and continue in versus sin that they are trying to bring to light and deal with. These are two very, very, very different types of people. One is usually a mark of a believing Christian who has the Spirit in them. Another is a mark of a Christian who's or a non-Christian who's walking down a dark path, walking away from the Lord. So, and the other's walking towards the Lord. So these are very different things. So keep that in mind as we're dealing with pastors. Do it without prejudice, doing nothing out of favoritism. And that's why he says, he reiterates the same truth that I was just going on a rant about. Verse 22, don't be too quick to appoint anyone as an elder. Okay? That's why this is so serious. As we discussed before, not just anyone should be a pastor. You need to look for not the degrees behind their name, not the letters, as I always say, behind their name, not how smart they are, none of that. Not if they wear fancy clothes. You need to be checking for character and Bible knowledge. That's it. That's a qualification for pastor. How good is their character? How godly are they? And how well do they know the scriptures? Right? These are the marks, along with other things, but those are the two main things that need to be seen, right? And looked for. So don't be too quick to appoint anyone as an elder. And look at this. This is really interesting, this passage in verse 22. He says, and don't share in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. What he's saying to Timothy, Paul's telling Timothy that when you appoint an elder, if they fall into sin, you bear a certain amount of responsibility, a certain amount of brunt of that sin because you appointed them. Now, some of this, it's inevitable if you're in the business, as Timothy and Paul were, of always appointing elders. It's in the reality that you're going to at some point miss something probably, or someone is going to stray by their volition and choice and choose to walk into sin when you maybe had no evidence for that previously. That's very possible, but there's a certain weight of responsibility to the one who appoints the pastor. This is different for different churches and different denominations and different associations for how this is done, how pastors are appointed. But for the one who does appoint a pastor, when they fall, when they choose to start to walk in sin, there's a certain amount of guilt. There's a certain amount of responsibility that you bear as the one who appointed that pastor, right? So don't be too quick to appoint anyone as an elder. That's why he says, and don't share in the sins of others, because there's a certain sharing in that sin of the pastor. Keep yourself pure. So if Timothy were to find out about the sin of an elder and not deal with it, he is then aiding him in the sin and stepping into protecting him in his sin and being guilty for that sin. But if Timothy sees the sin of that pastor and then confronts it and deals with it, he is choosing to not share in that sin of the pastor and to keep himself pure from it. And so these are complex issues. These are issues that happen all the time. I read about them all the time in the news. If you keep up with Christian news, I'm sure you do too, of pastors getting themselves into different situations because they're human too and not being wise. And they need to be dealt with, particularly, they need to be dealt with specifically, and they need to be dealt with wisdom and with godliness and in accordance with the scriptures of which we're learning right now. Lastly, in closing, Paul tells Timothy, he says, don't continue drinking only water, but use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. Some people's sins are obvious, preceding them to judgment, but the sins of others surface later. Likewise, good works are obvious, and those that are not obvious cannot remain hidden. So, pastors are usually under a lot of stress. A lot of times you'll see pastors' health gets run down very easily because of how much of the burden they carry in their prayer life, in their heart, in their mind, in their body. It ends up, right, the body is connected to the soul. We're one being, and so these things affect us physically. It's not uncommon pastors to get a stomach ulcer. It's not uncommon for pastors to literally worry themselves or stress themselves into health problems. I've seen it in my own life. I've seen it in the lives of other pastors. Sometimes the weight of what you're juggling in church and what you are thinking of, and knowing that these things in people's lives are in the balance of heaven and hell, it's really hard and it's really crippling at times. Leads some pastors into depression or different things or physical ailments. We see this in Timothy's life because of your stomach. Something was going on with Timothy's stomach. Like I said, stomach ulcers aren't uncommon. He says, and your frequent illnesses. Maybe his immune system's compromised and he's getting sick all the time. And probably because of, right, all that he's dealing with, as we've read, it's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot for Timothy, one guy, to be shouldering all this. This is a real heavy burden to bear. And so he tells him to drink a little wine, probably therapeutically, to help him with his stomach as medicine. And that's what verse 23 is about. Verse 24, he continues on finishing teaching him about the sin of elders, as we were just talking about in verse 22. Some people's sins are obvious. I imagine this as a fatherly tone, right? In verse 23 through 25, he goes on from telling Timothy in verse 21, I solemnly charge you, right? Like he's getting stern with Timothy. And then here in verse 23, he's coming with a fatherly tone and switching gears, saying, look, drink some wine because, the problems you're having. And he says in verse 24, look, Timothy, I can see at the fatherly tone, some people's sins are obvious, preceding them to the judgment. So sometimes a pastor or an elder is going to fall into sin, or a congregant, a person is going to fall or walk into sin as well. And it's going to be obvious. People are going to find out early. But the sins of others surface later. That's not always the case. Sometimes things are hidden for years. We see this, right? This was the big thing with the Catholic Church and the sexual abuse scandal, right? And there's way more problems going on than that, right? But for the general public, no one knew, right? And there were people in places that did know, but sometimes people are going to hide their sin and hide it well and hide it for a long period of time. And that sin will not surface till later for various reasons. And he says, likewise, good works are obvious, and those that are not obvious cannot remain hidden. So he tells them that those good works that are in the life of an elder, they're going to be obvious. You're going to see if there's fruit being born, and those that are not obvious cannot remain hidden. So that good fruit is going to come out eventually. It's just going to show. So look for that good fruit. When you don't see good fruit, you need to be curious as to what's going on. And so that is 1 Timothy chapter 5 from a perspective of someone obviously who has served in ministry and has seen many things personally, and has I've had to wrestle through these waters, and there's a lot of situations I think about when I think of these things. So I hope that's helpful for you. If this content is, if you stuck with me for this video, please check me out, like, subscribe. There's more content like this coming. We'll jump into 1 Timothy chapter 6. Hope you guys are blessed. If you have any questions about what we've talked about here, I'd encourage you to leave me a comment in the comment section down below. Always happy to answer any of those. And we will see you next time.